The most powerful democratic nations on Earth just wrapped 3 days of high-stakes diplomacy on the shores of Lake Geneva, and what they agreed on, what they left unresolved, and what it all means for the rest of the world is something every global citizen needs to understand right now. Welcome to Global Pulse, your daily briefing on the stories shaping our world. Today we are going deep on the 2026 G7 Summit in Évian-les-Bains, France, breaking down every major outcome, the fault lines that surfaced behind closed doors, and the big questions that still hang in the air. Let us start with the basics. The G7 is an informal grouping of 7 of the world's largest advanced democratic economies: the United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom, alongside the European Union. They meet once a year to coordinate on economic policy, international security, and global challenges. This year, France held the rotating presidency, and it chose the alpine lakeside town of Évian-les-Bains as the setting, a place that last hosted one of these summits back in 2003, making it the first French town to host the gathering twice. The summit ran from June 15 to June 17, 2026. France's approach was notably broader than in previous years. Rather than limiting the room to the 7 core members, the host invited 5 partner countries: India, Brazil, Egypt, Kenya, and South Korea, to participate throughout the discussions. Additional invitations went out to leaders from Ukraine, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and the United Arab Emirates. Syria received a G7 invitation for the very first time in the group's history. The result was a summit with a wider table and a more complex set of voices in the room. Now let us get into what actually happened. The biggest headline out of Evian is Ukraine. Going in, there were real questions about how unified the G7 would be. Coming out, leaders issued a joint geopolitical statement that represented what many observers called a notable shift in tone, particularly from Washington. The statement declared, in the words of the leaders themselves, that the G7 stands united in unwavering support for Ukraine in defending its freedom, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. That included concrete military commitments, an agreement to increase the delivery of air defense systems, additional interceptors, and long-range capabilities to Ukrainian forces. Leaders also signaled readiness to consider extending manufacturing licenses to Ukraine, which would allow the country to produce more of its own weaponry domestically. On top of that, the group pledged to increase pressure on Russia's war economy by strengthening sanctions, including those specifically targeting Russia's oil and gas sectors. What made this possible? The context matters enormously here, and we will come back to it in our deep dive. But briefly, a deal between the United States and Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz had just been signed at the Palace of Versailles on the final day of the summit. With that energy choke point coming back online, the G7 argued this was the right moment to tighten the economic vice on Moscow. On the Middle East, leaders acknowledged what they called a breakthrough. The G7 statement welcomed the United States-Iran agreement as, in their words, an historic opportunity to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon and to address regional ballistic threats. Leaders endorsed a multinational maritime initiative, led by France and the United Kingdom, to help restore commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, protecting merchant vessels and supporting verification that sea mines are cleared. On Lebanon, the group called for an immediate ceasefire and supported Lebanese authorities' efforts to ensure Hezbollah's disarmament. On Gaza and the West Bank, leaders emphasized the acceleration of humanitarian aid and reconstruction. In the economic space, France's core agenda item was reducing what it called global macroeconomic imbalances. That is a broad term that covers things like industrial overcapacity, excessive debt, underinvestment, and practices that distort fair competition. Leaders agreed that it is in everyone's interest to cooperate and coordinate economic policies to address these imbalances, calling on the International Monetary Fund and the OECD to monitor how domestic policy in major economies contributes to those global pressures. The discussions included concerns over export practices, industrial subsidies, and weak domestic consumption, though the final declaration did not name any specific country by name. On critical minerals, leaders adopted a declaration establishing a non-binding alliance, a Critical Minerals Resilience and Production Alliance, and agreed to coordinate on financing, stockpiling, recycling, and traceability. They set a target of reducing dependence on any single outside supplier for rare earths and permanent magnets to below 60% by 2030, with an ambition to reach 50% as soon as possible. This initiative followed significant disruptions caused by export restrictions on permanent magnets that had exposed just how concentrated global supply chains are. In digital policy and artificial intelligence, leaders committed to protecting children online by, among other things, adapting the language of AI systems when interacting with minors. G7 members also agreed to work with leading technology companies to accelerate what they called the safe and beneficial deployment of AI across society. In global health, the summit made history in two ways. First, it was the first G7 leaders' summit to make cancer a formal priority. Leaders endorsed a coordinated approach covering research support, data sharing, pediatric cancers, poor prognosis cancers, and universal access to healthcare. Second, leaders issued an urgent call for a coordinated response to the Bundibugyo Ebola outbreak affecting parts of Central and East Africa, committing over $1 billion in funding in line with United Nations efforts. On organized crime, the group renewed commitments to fight drug trafficking by strengthening cooperation between international seaports, and tackled migrant smuggling by pledging to dismantle criminal networks operating across borders. All told, leaders adopted 9 formal declarations, a significant output for a summit that carried enormous political complexity. Now here is the part that really matters, what the summit did not produce. For the second consecutive year, the G7 failed to issue a traditional final joint communiqué. A communiqué requires full consensus from all members and has long been the standard measure of G7 cohesion. Instead, France opted for a series of narrower joint statements on specific issues. Analysts and watchdog organizations described this as a signal of deepening divisions that the group was, in some areas, unable to bridge. Trade tensions between the United States and its allies were evident throughout the summit, including friction over tariffs and digital taxation. Climate and fossil fuel dependency were notably absent from the final declarations as structured priorities, something civil society organizations pointed out sharply after the summit closed. Gender equality also did not appear among the core themes of the International Partnerships Declaration, an absence that advocacy groups highlighted. On the Strait of Hormuz, while the group ultimately agreed on the importance of reopening the waterway, there were reported differences throughout the summit over the mechanics of maritime security operations and the broader role of Western military forces in the region. Analysts at the Council on Foreign Relations noted that while the summit appeared to produce a rare moment of transatlantic alignment, the consensus was, in their assessment, more brittle than it appeared on the surface. European leaders worked hard during the summit to convince Washington that Ukraine has real momentum on the battlefield and that Russia, not Ukraine, needs to make concessions, but the durability of that alignment depends on factors that remain outside the G7's direct control. Now for our story of the day, and it is the Ukraine commitment, because it represents the summit's most consequential and most contested outcome. To understand why this matters, you need the background. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the G7 has been the primary coordinating body for Western sanctions and military support. But over the past year, that coordination has become harder. Munitions stockpiles in some member countries have been strained. Negotiations to end the war have stalled. And geopolitical attention across the alliance was pulled significantly toward the conflict involving Iran, which had disrupted global energy markets and consumed diplomatic bandwidth. Going into Evian, Ukraine's president joined the summit on the second day and held bilateral talks with multiple leaders. The core ask was straightforward: more air defense, more long-range capability, and, critically, permission for Ukraine to manufacture its own interceptors rather than depending entirely on external supply. The G7 delivered on all 3 fronts in its joint statement. Leaders committed to increased air defense deliveries, expanded long-range capabilities, and opened the door to manufacturing licenses that could allow Ukraine to produce interceptors domestically. The group also pledged to help Ukraine withstand the coming winter by supporting its energy resilience. And they committed to tighten financial sanctions on the Russian energy sector. The timing was significant. The United States-Iran deal had just reopened the Strait of Hormuz, easing global oil supply concerns. G7 leaders argued explicitly in their statement that this was the right moment to press harder on Russian energy revenues, since the market now had an alternative supply pathway coming back online. But analysts cautioned against reading the statement as a definitive shift. The most critical forms of support, intelligence sharing and air defense interceptors, remain constrained by real-world scarcity. The Iran conflict had drawn down munitions stockpiles that are not quickly replenished. And the long-term question of what kind of peace settlement the G7 would accept remains unanswered. European diplomats have stressed that any deal must include robust security guarantees for Ukraine, not just a ceasefire. That position is not fully shared across the G7. What Evian showed is that the group can still produce meaningful joint commitments when the geopolitical stakes are high enough. The question that follows every G7 summit is the same: what happens between now and the next one? Commitments on paper must translate into deliveries, funding disbursements, and sustained political will. The G7's credibility rests not on what leaders sign, but on what their governments actually do in the months that follow. Next up for the international calendar, the NATO summit in Ankara, where Ukraine's security future will again be central to discussions. And later this year, the G20 summit in Miami, where the United States holds the presidency, will pick up several threads from Evian, including the macroeconomic imbalances agenda and critical minerals cooperation. The world is watching to see whether the unity displayed on the shores of Lake Geneva holds, or whether the fractures visible beneath the surface widen into something that cannot be papered over with 9 separate declarations. If you want to keep pace with how these stories develop, from NATO in Ankara to the G20 in Miami, subscribe to Global Pulse and hit the bell icon so you never miss a headline.